Ayan, so magandang hapon po ulit sa ating lahat. Good afternoon. I think there are some newcomers earlier, so I'd like to reintroduce myself. I'm Jessie Varquez. I'm with the Behavioral Sciences Department of the College of Liberal Arts ng BLSU. And then I'm teaching anthropology because I obtained my bachelor's and master's degree in anthropology from UP. And outside Lasal, I'm also with the Ugnayang Pang-Aghamtao or the Anthropological Association of the Philippines. So the reason I'm here because our former department chair forwarded an email from Dr. Elmer asking for someone to talk in our department about this topic. And konting kwento na lang din, I initially declined this because although I have extensive research among indigenous peoples, I don't have a particular research or data on nutrition and health among them. Ibang ecological and mostly environmental yung in-explore kong themes. But our former department chair has this persuasion, which I eventually agreed. So that's why I'm here. But I'm happy to be here hearing the goal of the program of Zero Hunger Lab. The photos that I will share, by the way, in my presentation are all my fieldwork photos. So this one is from Agusan Marsh in Southeast Mindanao, Northeast Mindanao. Pwede na rin Central Mindanao, actually. So what I will be talking about is health, nutrition, and indigenous peoples. And Dr. Elmer said, I only have 10 minutes to talk about this, so I don't know how to um, include everything here in just 10 minutes, but most likely what I will share to you will be just teasers, no? Para matitilate yung research interest natin about these topics. So I outlined my brief presentation in three themes, yung indigenous peoples in the Philippines, and then the health social sciences perspectives on health and nutrition, and then the challenges and opportunities that the Zero Hunger Lab might be able to explore and eventually engage on in your future research and endeavors. So the topic about indigenous peoples in the Philippines is actually very broad and complex. And but I'd like to highlight it in these aspects. In terms of population, there are estimates that there are about 17 million belonging to 110 plus groups. So they're estimates because officially in our Philippine statistics, they are not included yet, although in recent efforts ng census, meron ng fina-factor in na ethnicity. But in the past, puro estimate lang because wala talagang solid statistical data on how many they are. But they are mostly concentrated in Luzon, particularly in the Cordilleras, and in Mindanao. But also there are also indigenous groups in the Visayas. And it's also 110 groups because it depends on who's counting. So from the NCIP's point of view, it may be 110 plus. From the linguistic point of view, because indigenous groups are mostly identified by the languages that they speak, there could be many. Another important aspect or dimension to the indigenous peoples in the Philippines is the passage of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act in 1997, or the IPRA. This is very important because in the region in Southeast Asia, we are the only country so far that has passed a national legislation that directly protects and sustains the indigenous communities' rights and basically rights. So may implication din kasi ito sa research natin because if we want to do research among indigenous peoples, the NCIP would require us to do secure, free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC. So even if we find it very interesting, we have really good intentions, there are bureaucratic and institutional barriers that we need to pass through in order to do research among many indigenous peoples. And medyo complicated din ang issue ng indigenous peoples in terms of political and ideological na mga leanings. No? So hindi, what I'm trying to say is, wag tayong basta-basta pumunta sa indigenous peoples just because we want to do research among them or with them. If you will ask what makes the indigenous peoples in the Philippines unique, or particularly interesting, is that they have historical and cultural attachment to ancestral domains. So the domains here could refer to land and water because meron ding mga cases in Palawan, in southern Philippines, where indigenous peoples claim ancestral waters, which is actually interesting sa international point of view because mostly ang ancestral domains na discourse is framed on terrestrial na mga dimensions. So the famous quote of, if you are familiar with the icon in the struggle of the indigenous people, si Maclean Dulag, that land is life. No? To be indigenous means to be attached to their land. So yun yung isa sa mga importanteng dimension ng indigeneity ng mga kababayan natin. Na actually, pag pumunta ka ng marami indigenous groups, they can easily be identified as peasants or poor farmers. No? But what makes them indigenous is that they have a historical and cultural attachment to their domains, whether land or water. And I think it's obvious to you now that they are one of the most marginalized, disadvantaged, and disenfranchised groups. No? So when we say marginalized, socially and economically, they are mostly dwelling in far-flung areas because of colonization process. No? Atras sila ng atras, and then eventually they're already in the margins of civilization. And consequently, they are disadvantaged in terms of the basic social services that we receive in many facets, no? Health, education, public services, lahat na. And disenfranchised as well because even if umatras na sila in remote areas, maraming mga development aggression encroachments, no? Mining, explorations of different minerals, forest resources. No? So further, na-disenfranchise yung mga grupo na ito. So the photo I'm showing here is a mother and a child in Davao del Norte in one of my research before. They are Talaingod, Manobo. So what are the social sciences perspectives on health and nutrition in order to contextualize lang yung ano yung interest natin when we talk about health and nutrition. So one of the basic assumptions is that eating is a practice. Although this may sound like an obvious concept to us, but it's a daily activity that we do, right? Yung kumakain. So therefore, madali siyang ma-overlook. So from a purely nutritional or biological point of view kasi, pwede lang natin isipin na ano ba yung nutrition na nakukuha mo when you eat, no? But from a social science perspective, when you talk about eating, it means that we have to consider what do people consider as food in the first place, no? So tayo, we consider food yung mga typical na natin na kinakain, but there are some people who would eat insects, no, or yung mga insekto. There are some people who would eat animals like dogs or horses, which we don't consider as food. So there are many layers towards this particular assumption that eating is a practice, no, about how people eat, why they eat the way they do. So bakit tayo nagkakamay, no? Bakit nag-chopstick yung mga East Asian cultures? Why is it may fine dining with all the utensils yung mga European cultures, no? So iba't ibang way of eating food. So lahat yan ay kasama doon sa assumption that eating is a practice. And how eating habits change. We usually associate our identity with the food that we eat, no? But when we look at this from a historical perspective, they're actually part of changes. No? They were part of the changes that happened in the past. Like for instance, yung pasta is mostly associated sa Italian cuisine. No? But if you will look at it historically, the wheat and other sorts of carbohydrates na panggawa ng pasta is not originally in those regions, no? Coming from different areas. Ganon din sa atin. We often hear yung mga Chinese influences on food culture, yung mga ng mga Pilipino, mga ganyan. So laging nagbabago, in other words, yung eating practices natin. And in relation to this, another core assumption in the social science on health and nutrition is that it is embedded, meaning the health and nutrition issues and themes may kinalaman yun sa cultural practices. No? So this is an elaboration of the point earlier. Including ecological dimensions. No? So bakit nila kinakain yun? Most likely, ang sagot, kasi yun yung available sa area nila. Or yun yung nakikita sa ecological and environmental context nila. And even political ones, no? And even religious and symbolic ones. No? Bakit hindi kumakain ang mga Muslim ng baboy na endemic naman siya sa Southeast Asia? So mga Southeast Asian Muslims don't eat that. So why? Because of religious and other reasons. So in other words, again, from the point of view of nutrition and biological needs, we may look at food as something na necessity, no? Yung common paradigm na go grow glow, no? Tinuturo sa mga grade school. But if you put the cultural and social context, it has to be nuanced, no? Because not everyone thinks what is edible and what is acceptable for them universally. May kanya-kanya tayong interpretation of what is food and what is palatable. And probably this is in connection to what the first presentation offered, yung multidisciplinary perspective. Another important aspect ng social science perspective on health and nutrition is yung interdisciplinarity. Si Sir, hindi niya dinefine na yung interdisciplinarity, so hindi pa na rin gagawin ang new multidisciplinarity. But as the name implies, no, hindi lang from the social science perspective yung pag-understand ng complexity ng food and eating habits, but also coming from the different traditional academic disciplines, including political science, biomedicines, no, chemistry, nutrition, etc. So if interdisciplinary yun kapag lahat ng yan ay nag-contribute towards a common understanding of the particular themes that they're being explored. So yung picture naman dito is who could guess ano tong root crop na ito? If familiar kayo. On the upper right hand corner.
Sugarcane?
Cassava.
Yep, yes, it's a cassava or kamoting kahoy. And on the lower bottom is the coffee, a native coffee. So this was served to us when we hiked on Mount Apo. Yung indigenous group naman doon ay Tagabawa, Bagobo yung napuntahan namin. As a marriage of the topic earlier, yung indigenous peoples in the Philippines and nutrition and health on social sciences, I encountered this publication sometime in 2009. You can easily check this, and this can be easily accessible online, yung indigenous peoples and food systems. And what I'd like to highlight here is that one of the common din ito na findings in many researches throughout the globe is that ang taas nung knowledge ng mga indigenous people sa species diversity ng context nila. So, lagi ko rin itong pinapagawa sa klase ko because I also teach anthropology of food sa DLSU na they identify a certain food group, no? And then most DLSU students would only say a few, like if I will say rice, no? They only know rice, no? Na bigas lang yun. But if you will ask the indigenous groups, for instance, especially the indigenous groups that are farming rice, they could tell you a lot of varieties of rice, no? Whether introduced from the outside or their traditional varieties. So what I'm trying to point out here in this slide is that indigenous peoples, because of their deep entanglements and relationship with their surroundings and their environment, have deep knowledge as well, no? Kung ano yung nasa palibot nila. So this is another angle that the Zero Hunger Lab might be interested to look at, no? Ano yung diversity na alam ng mga indigenous groups that you would want to partner with. So in terms of challenges and opportunities, the immediate answer is to document traditional food sources, no? So I got here a series of questions which I clipped from a particular source, kaya siya naka-quotes, no? So ito yung mga tanong na mga interesting daw according to that particular source. So what is the agricultural potential and what land is available for cultivation? So I find this important because even if we design research that will create food security among indigenous groups, but that indigenous group do not have access to their land in the first place, no? Hindi rin yun viable in the long run. Hindi siya magiging sustainable. Kaya key sa issue ng indigenous peoples yung access sa land availability nila. Not only access but ownership, no? Control sa land nila. How is food harvested, stored, and prepared? This would vary from one indigenous group to another. What is the general acceptability pattern within the community? In some of the groups that indigenous groups that I work with, meron talagang seasonality concept, no? Yung kakainin lang ito for this particular period because it's available, and it's also because embedded in the cultural context during that time, whether may celebration or whether may weather patterns that they'd like to observe. And then, is this a reasonable food for the population groups, especially vulnerable to dietary deficits and micronutrients, such as pregnant and lactating women and young children? So karamihan kasi, based sa paper na ito na kinonsult ko, marami kasing nutrition interventions ang they do not factor in nga yung gender as well as vulnerability by sector, including children. So like for instance, in one of the MS nutrition thesis that I sat, ang proposal nung estudyante is to yung mga beans no, na found in the Cordillera. But she found out based on her nutritional analysis na hindi pala magandang combination yon sa mga traditional foods nung mga indigenous group na yun sa Cordillera. So yun yung isa sa mga interdisciplinary factor, no? Bringing in social science to nutrition studies, but also making sure that what you are trying to intervene is appropriate, no? To the group that you are trying to intervene. And then if not, how might it possibly be adapted for consumption by these vulnerable groups? So hindi rin kasi kailan na malnourished ang maraming indigenous groups sa Pilipinas. So kaya din talagang aggressive yung interventions ng coming from the outside, whether from the government or non-government groups. No? But this is the caveat here that we have to be attentive to their cultural nuances. The photo here is, can you guess what that is? It's also from Agusan in one of my fieldworks. It's found in a certain palm, and they eat that with gusto. Gustong-gusto nila yan.
Coconut barrow? Tama ba?
Yes, tama si Ma, meron yang hindi ko nakita kung sino yung sumagot. But it's also found in coconuts, but these are grubs or yung mga weevils that eventually when they grow up, they will become yung mga malalaking bugs. No? But this one is a larval stage and very juicy. But in terms of nutritional content, because this was actually part of my thesis, master sa Anthro, pulo lang siya fats and oils. No? Hindi siya nutritionally rich. But the indigenous groups there, they find this delicacy, no? Kasi hindi siya ganoon kadaling hanapin. So that is part also of the foodscape ng area na yun. And then in terms of challenges and opportunities as well, isa sa mga buzzword, no, kung gamitin natin yung term ni Sir kanina, in doing indigenous research is yung IKSP or Indigenous Knowledge Systems and Practices. So maraming domains or facets ito, but yung may kinalaman sa topic natin ngayon is yung indigenous food and food waste. No? So when we say indigenous, may implicit assumption doon that it's not similar to mainstream food cultures. No? So if we eat rice all the time, like breakfast, lunch, and dinner, the indigenous food waste and food would tell us otherwise. No? They diversify their carbohydrate sources. So isa yun sa mga potential research areas. And also subsistence strategies. Karamihan ng mga indigenous groups are farmers and they farm not because they want to sell it, but they want to eat it sa domestic na consumption. And farming systems as well. Iba-iba ang farming system ng indigenous groups. Ang daming research about it, but I would no longer elaborate on this one. Ang malapit sa disiplina ko, yung anthropology, is yung ethnobotany or ethnozoology. Ethno with another discipline is essentially ethnoscience. No? Ang assumption nito, meron silang sariling knowledge system about it na not necessarily compatible with the Western understanding. So botany, pag nag-take ka ng botany sa college, mag-major ka, standard yon all over the world. But when you go to a particular group, they have plant knowledge. So we will call that ethnobotany. And this is special because sa buong mundo, ang Philippines ang pioneering research area dito. No? Yung American anthropologist na si Harold Conklin, he was the pioneer in ethnobotanical research na ginawa niya sa mga mangyan sa Mindoro. So tayo yung isa sa mga naunang site in doing ethnobotanical research. And also ethnozoological. So sa ethnobotanical research, you can explore ano yung mga plant species na food sources kasi hindi naman lahat nakakain. No? At ano yung plant species na pwedeng medicine and other purposes. And then I have to underscore this, that the research and documentation activities, yung mga nabanggit natin na IKSPs na possible research areas, should be informed by participatory approach and rights-based paradigm. So participatory, I'm sure you've heard this along the way, that it it treats not the people or the indigenous people for this matter, not just participants, no, but our subjects, but also participants in the research formulation, no. And rights-based approach means na hindi wala na yung victim paradigm na we are doing the research because kawawa ang mga indigenous groups, lagi sila but right nila in the first place, no, na right nila na kumain, right nila na marinig, right nila na and all those human rights enshrined in the UN Declaration. So yan, isa yan sa mga sort of SOP ngayon in doing indigenous research among indigenous communities. And then I think this is my last slide. Another challenge and opportunity is yung paano i-frame yung mga gusto nating gawin sa mga indigenous groups. So one of the frames na pwedeng tignan is yung food security, no? Yung na-explain na yata ni who was the second speaker, Johnny yata. I'm not sure, naputol siya. That there are many issues about food security, but from this particular angle, we can look at the EMIC perspective. EMIC is just a fancy term sa anthro, meaning insider's perspective. No? So from the outside, we may think na when we put up this together, they may be food secured, but what about from their own point of view? No? Baka hindi yun ang notion nila ng food security. And maraming research na mag-elaborate further on that. Availability is also very important because yun nga, dapat nandun siya kapag kailangan siya. And accessibility. So available nga siya, hindi naman siya accessible dahil mahal or hindi nabibili ng mga indigenous groups or wala silang access in the first place. And adequacy also. No? So available nga siya, accessible nga siya, pero kulang naman yung supply nung gustong kainin sa group na yun. And then another thing is yung acceptability. So available, accessible, and adequate siya pero hindi naman kakainin ng mga indigenous groups na ang balak nating nutrition intervention sa kanila. And then as an alternative to food security, or not an alternative, but another way of looking at it is the concept of food sovereignty. No? Kinilip ko na lang yung definition ng La Campesina, yung nag-isip ng concept na ito. How is it different from food security? Food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods. Their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. So ito yung full ownership ng mga indigenous groups. No? Kaya nga from the word na sovereign talaga siya. No? Meaning, yun yung dapat nilang they should own their food production systems and agriculture systems. No? Sa food secure kasi, pwedeng silang, halimbawa, may supply lagi ng bigas, pero saan nanggagaling yung supply na yun? No? They may not have a control. So isang flick lang ng political changes, baka probably food insecure na sila agad, no? Because wala silang control sa pagkain nila. So yun yung concept ng food sovereignty. Another one that merges with environmental themes is yung agrobiodiversity. No? So mahalaga itong mga crop diversity, wild plant biodiversity, livestock diversity, aquatic diversity, no? Lahat to which can be explored by interdisciplinary means, no? From the environmental sciences, from other forms of sciences that can explore these types of diversity. Arthropod, yung mga insects, no? They're very important in the ecological context ng farming systems ng mga katutubo or ng mga indigenous peoples.